Yeah. Well, they use, for sure, I can use my fiber, like, they have shred paper. But that one should have a fiber. Yes, I didn't imagine. Now try it, Jake. Oh, we actually went on to the next one. Okay, so that was longer than I planned. All right, some announcements before we begin. One, apparently I didn't attach the slides on Blackboard yesterday, but they're attached now. Thank you for pointing that out. I don't remember everything I wanted to talk about. Hopefully we will get through this today or tomorrow, or, we will end it on Wednesday, no matter what. So you will have your exam over the American Revolution section on Wednesday. It'll be the same as before. You'll have 24 hours. We'll post it after class. We're gonna kind of skip going through each and every battle. So there is a YouTube video. I can't seem to figure out how to make those links actually hyperlinks. So you're gonna have to cut them and paste them to get them to find where you need to go, but you're smart enough to do that. I also offered an extra credit on this section. I am related to Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone plays a part in the frontier fighting. But since we're not going through all the battles, we're not going to go into that part. I think he was actually a pretty cool dude, but he has a tie to San Angelo that does not include me. So figure it out. send me an email with what it is, and I'll give you 5 points. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the American Revolution. When we ended, we had just adopted the Declaration of Independence, but the fighting had actually already begun. We talked about Lexington, Concord, and on July 2nd, the day that we actually declared our independence, the British are landing at the undefended Staten Island to begin the process of taking back their colony that was, not behaving well. The British are going to commit over 2/3 of their army and half of our navy to fighting this battle, fighting this war. Now, remember, Britain, the British Empire is huge, and it stretches around the world. So now she's committed 2/3 of her army just to the colonies. That leaves spread pretty thin elsewhere. And the fighting is actually going to spread beyond the colonies, much like the French and Indian Wars. It could, before it's all said and done, be considered a world war. So Britain's at a disadvantage in one way. She has a huge empire. She's having to overcommit in one area. That area is across the ocean. So supply lines are long. Communication lines are long. But she had an army. And she had a navy. And it's probably, at this point in time, the greatest army and navy in the world. Britain is undoubtedly one of the leading powers. Now, these upstart Americans don't have that. They don't have an army. They barely have militia. So they have to start from scratch. And a navy, not worth mentioning at this point. It gets there. But to begin with, everything has to start from scratch. So on July 2nd, we declare our independence. British troops land in Staten Island. By mid-August, the British had amassed around 32,000 troops just in the New York area, like New York City area. Washington, to answer the threat, takes his roughly 19,000 poorly trained soldiers and heads from Boston to New York. The British hope to make this, why did that not change? Hold on, we got an issue. I love technology when it works. Hopefully we don't do this every time. All right. The British are hoping that they can take New York, remember New York's one of the middle colonies, and cut off the New England colonies from the rest. Washington determines that he has to protect and defend New York. And had the British been a little more bold, a little more committed, they could have wrapped up the war within the first 6 months. They had the trained troops, they had the numbers. Washington had luck. So he gets to New York. He has around 2,800 men by the end of August. By December, he's only going to have 3,000. Enlistments in this new militia were short, 6 months or less. Thousands of them just walked away. They went home. They are attacked in New York. A rainstorm saves them. Had Howe pressed his advantage, he could have wrapped up the whole thing. But Washington realizes that his best chance of winning is just to not lose. Hang in there by just enough to wear the enemy down. Okay, I'll come back to it. And it's not just the soldiers that are going to war. Society is going to war too. Anytime we have a war, anytime we have a war now, anytime we've ever had a war, people choose sides. You're for or against it, or you're indifferent. And at first, that's how it lines out. Patriots were for the war. Tories, also called loyalists, were people who were loyal to England, felt that basically all this independence was nonsense and that we were being ungrateful children of the crown. And then there were people who were indifferent. And people had their reasons for choosing. If you were a merchant who was heavily tied to London and your business relied on that tie, you might be more inclined to stick with England. Early in the war, the English army offers to free slaves. So if you're a planter whose slaves are running off to join the English army, that might make you a patriot. And people would switch. The war divided families, divided friends. Benjamin Franklin's illegitimate son was a Tory. I mean, Benjamin Franklin is like the epitome of the patriot. He ends up disowning him and writing him out of the will over it. Loyalists were numerous, but not nearly as numerous as the British hoped. They made up roughly 3% of the population, and they based that on how many people left the colonies during the war. And even in England, opinion was split. They didn't want to pay for another army. They didn't want to pay for another war. But the English keep making these assumptions based on the strength of the loyalists. There were really two fighting forces in the American army. There was the militia and the army. The militia were the home guard. They were the hang on, let's see if I have a quote on that. This is what my quote was. Yeah. The militia were the ones that would just kind of spring up out of nowhere and disappear. Washington, I don't have that marked, but here it is. Washington of the militia said, they come in, you cannot tell how. They go, you cannot tell when. And act, you cannot tell where. Consume your provisions, exhaust your stores, and leave you at the last critical moment. And they had a tendency to do that. They just kind of showed up whenever the fighting got thick, and then they would disappear. Most were farmers, small businessmen, sailors, fishermen, whatever, depending on the area. A lot of them are more, you see more concentration in the South. There were farming, there were chores to be done. They would go home. The army, and the militia also tended to be a little more brutal. They liked ambush and hand-to-hand fighting better than they liked lining up like a professional army and facing their opponent. They were really good at guerrilla warfare. But they also tended to be a little more brutal when they caught people, tending to torture and kill prisoners. There's some episodes in the South where they're besieging a British stronghold, and as they capture the British Indian allies, they're tomahawking them in full view of the garrison. Now, they didn't kill the British when they finally got to the British. They didn't. They did leave those. They let them leave, but they were a little more brutal. The Continental Army was, as it is today, a volunteer army. There was no conscription. There was no draft. If you wanted to join the army, you joined the army. Before the war is over, they're going to be better trained and more reliable than the militia. But in the beginning, it was kind of a rough start. You know, these were ordinary people. These were the tavern workers, the dock workers, the farmers that joined up to fight. The government, at this point, there really is no government. It's that group of guys that came together to write the Declaration of Independence, but there's no formal structure of a government in the colonies yet. So there's no finances. So how do you pay these guys? Because they are being paid. It's not an unpaid position. The states were supposed to pony up, but no state ever provided more than just part of what they were due. A lot of times for supplies, the Patriot Army just took what they needed, but they at least offered receipts, promises to pay later. A lot of the colonies sold loyalist estates. If you were a loyalist, they'd kick you off your land and sell it. Some of that money went to pay the army, and they finally resort just to printing money. The one thing that the new government does do right is they supply arms. Munitions are a little, ammunition's a little more iffy, but in 1777, they established a government arsenal at Springfield, and they do manage to keep a supply of guns coming. Most of the wartime munitions were either captures from the British or supplies brought in by the French and later the Spanish. I know we've talked a couple of times about how smallpox was raging. That is actually one of those weird historical things. Some of their early battles are lost because of smallpox. You know, there's a point where a fourth of Washington's army at any one time is down with smallpox. So in 1777, he takes a big risk and secretly vaccinates his entire army with a brand new vaccine that came out. Kept it secret from the British. It was probably one of the best wartime moves Washington made. By 1777, I won't say things are rocking along for the Americans, but they're okay. And the British have some big setbacks. They again decide that bisecting the colonies is the way to go. But their plans to bisect the colonies come to naught with a resounding defeat at Saratoga. Along with the defeat at Saratoga, France officially enters the picture. The French had supported the Americans from the beginning, basically, with supplies, mostly gunpowder. But when word comes of the success at Saratoga, and if y'all watch that video on the battles, more of this will make sense. France was ready to step in. The word of Saratoga brought such great excitement to France, they celebrated almost as if it was a French victory. And in 1778, the Americans and the French signed two treaties. The Treaty of Amity and Commerce, which recognized the United States as a country and offered trade concessions. Getting recognition was key. You can't be somebody if no one will recognize you're that somebody. It gives them legitimacy. There's another foreign country that's saying, yeah, you're no longer British. You're your own country. And then they signed the Treaty of Alliance. And the Treaty of Alliance stated that if France entered the war, both sides would fight until American independence was won. It also states that neither side would declare a truce without agreement of the other. It went on to guarantee each other's possessions in America, which at this point the French don't really have anything on the continent, but they do have some West Indies islands, some stuff in South America. And France agreed not to go after Canada or any of the other British holdings on the American mainland. So France is not trying to get back what they lost in the French and Indian Wars. They're just trying to protect what they still have. Spain will enter the battle in 1779, but they enter as a French ally and not a United States one. And this is going to cause some issues later on. The French will pretty quickly start firing on French ships, which is a declaration of war, or an act. It's an act of war. And by 1780, the British will also declare war on the Dutch, because the Dutch continue trading with the Americans and the French. And by that time, by 80, fighting has spread to the Mediterranean, to the West Indies, to Africa, to India, and at sea. So it actually spreads around the world. By 78, Lord North could see that the cause was lost, was ready to throw in the towel, but King George III wouldn't let him. He refused to let him resign. He refused to let him make peace. And in March of 78, the House of Commons granted all the demands that the Americans had made prior to the war. They repealed the Townsend Tea Act. They repealed the Massachusetts Government Act. There were prohibitory acts, which were dealt with commerce. And said, fine, you can have what you want, just stop fighting and go back to being good colonists. They send peace commissioners to the colonies to negotiate. And the Continental Congress, which we have by now, we'll talk about that in a minute, refuses, or no, we've had Continental Congress, but what we don't have is the Constitution. Continental Congress refuses to receive them unless they recognize American independence or promise a full withdrawal of troops. And at the same time, the British were actually pulling out of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is where Continental Congress is meeting, which didn't help the negotiators any. That was really their only, bargaining chip, were the troops that were in the city, and they were being pulled out to go elsewhere anyway. So you've got peace commissioners that can't talk, and the war goes on. So now the British decide we're just going to go the south. We're going to put all our hopes in the south. The south. That was not where I was going with that. Let me back up a little bit. Hang on a second. I don't know if I've opened the right slides. Okay. Before we talk about the South, let's talk about Valley Forge for a second. In the 1700s, most armies didn't fight in the winter. You fought in the spring and summer in the decent months, and then in the winter, everybody went into winter quarters, and you just kind of hung out and tried to survive. Did it not? It didn't move again? No. There it is. No. Okay. Yes. Okay. So the winter of 78, 77, 78 was hard on the American Army, but it's also a turning point. The previous winter had also been hard, 76 to 77. But Valley Forge is one we talk about because it really does turn the tide in terms of how the Army is built. It was really bad. A lot of the soldiers were without shoes, without blankets. It was bitterly cold. They were less than adequately fed. Disease was rampant in the camps. Most of the horses will die from starvation or exposure. A lot of the horses also got eaten. By February, there were around 7,000 troops that were too ill for duty. More than 2,500 are going to die. At least 1,000 will desert. Washington turns to foraging the nearby area, offering receipts to be honored by the Continental Congress in order to get enough food to keep his men going. And they survived the winter. And March saw them returning to good strength, but it also offered Washington a time where he could train his troops. Wasn't quite fighting season yet. People were getting stronger. And we get some more outside help. One of Washington's issues is he's probably the most experienced officer in the United States. And he doesn't have that much experience. He's never led a huge army. He's never directed artillery. He was a militia soldier during the French and Indian Wars. He was not a general. And he's the best we got. So we don't have officers underneath him that are any better trained. But we get some people from outside. Two in particular stand out. Friedrich Wilhelm, who was a Prussian, he's the Baron von Steuben. If you watch the cartoon series I put on Blackboard, it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. He almost single-handedly whips the troops into shape. He's a professional soldier. He's kind of a soldier of fortune. Through interpretation and profanity, because he was Prussian and he didn't speak English. He whips the troops into shape. He teaches them the basics of combat, hand-to-hand fighting. Then we have Gilbert de Montier, who was the Marquis de Lafayette, who was a wealthy idealist who came to the colonies to offer his support to the cause, said if Washington would make him a general, he would fight for free. He's better for the morale. He helps and he gets Washington organized. He ends up being his most trusted aide. And by the end of March, they're beginning to look like an army. And the morale is boosted when Congress promises extra pay and post-war bonuses. You know, if you stick in, don't leave like everybody else, then word of the allegiance with France also boosted their morale. So by the end of the winter of 77, 78, we have a real honest to God army. And now they're ready to face the British. But the British have decided that they are going to focus on the South. They believed that there were more loyalists there, and there probably were, but there weren't the numbers that the British hoped for. You know, they thought, you know, we'll show up with a dozen redcoats and hundreds of loyalists will pop up, ready to defend the crown. Also, if you can only keep part of it, the South was the part they wanted to keep. That's where all the raw materials come from. The cotton, the indigo, the tar, the lumber. The area was much more economically valuable than the rest of the colonies. And they were doing pretty good. They had some early successes. And by November, the British had taken Savannah. They come in from the sea. They take Savannah, Georgia, and they're going to go up. And they head to Charleston. But they head to Charleston plundering along the way. And it wasn't like the Americans who took some cows and some pigs and offered a receipt. The British were brutal. It was more the rape and plunder type. Burn their houses. You know, there was no regard. And when you act like that, people don't like you. That's not how you win friends and influence people. So the loyalists that were in the area were quickly made into patriots. And by this time, there's no middle ground. You aren't indifferent. And it gets really rough, particularly in the South and in the backcountry, where it just turns into a running battle between patriots and loyalists. And you know, this is the era where you tarred and feathered people. And it doesn't sound bad, but have you ever got hot tar on you, or hot syrup, or hot anything that's sticky? You can't get it off. So they would pour hot tar on someone, cover them with feathers. That was a humiliation part. And if you didn't die from the burns immediately, the beatings that usually went with it, or shock, you would die from infection that set in when you couldn't get the wounds cleaned, because now you have third-degree burns all over your body and you can't get it. And you know, by the time they peel off all the tar, now you have open wounds in an era before antibiotics, and you're going to get sick and die. That was kind of a side note, sorry. Anyway, so the British are headed to Charleston. They're plundering along the way. Horatio Gates, the American general who won at Saratoga, is sent south to face the British in Cornwallis. Problems for the British were that the loyalist strength was not what they hoped for. And like I said, the plundering was brutal, turned off even the loyalists. And finally, their last problem is they go too far. The British regularly allowed their men to execute patriot leaders. are patriots, period. And there is a group of patriots that are in the backcountry. They're called the Over Mountain Men. And two British leaders decide that they're going to go over the mountain to get these Over Mountain Men. Well, the Over Mountain Men hear about it. Say, we'll save you the trouble. We'll come for you. And they meet at Kings Mountain. They decimate the British forces. But it kind of starts this guerrilla warfare that just reigns throughout the area between patriots and Tory. Guerrilla warfare is what they fought in the backcountry, in the frontier as well, but with more American wins. In the South, it just is ugly. But finally, Gates is replaced by Greene. Greene will face the British at Yorktown. In December of 78, Cornwallis joins Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is the one who starts out as an American, ends as British. He is a young officer who lacks a moral compass, has a lot of gambling debts, and an overindulgent wife. To solve some of these problems and to assuage a slight that he got from Washington when Washington reprimanded him for some of his actions, he decides that he's going to turn over the garrison at West Point to the British. He doesn't get caught, but a go-between does. But Arnold escapes to join the British. So now Arnold and Cornwallis are in Virginia with around 7,200 men. Cornwallis chooses Yorktown on Chesapeake Bay because it's easily defensible. It's on the bay. The British Navy holds the seas, so it's safe. Washington is tied up in New York. So he's going to use Yorktown as his southern base and move out. But some unexpected things come into play. Well, the French had been, and Washington had taken a while before the French actually, they were our allies, but it took a while before they actually jumped into action. And the French had dropped around 6,000 troops in Newport, Rhode Island. But then the British blockaded their ships in that bay, and they're kind of stuck there. But they're they're sitting in Newport. They're going to join Washington in an attack on New York. And while they're getting this coordinated, they're almost ready to attack. Another French group of ships, can't come up with the right word for that, under the French Admiral Francois Joseph Paul de Grasse, sends word that he is en route and he's aimed for Chesapeake. So Washington has to make a decision. Do I attack New York? What do I do about the French? They're coming into Chesapeake. So he decides, no, we're going to pull out and we're going to take the 3,000 Americans and the 6,000 French that are at Newport, and we're going to head south. On August 30, 1781, de Grasse reaches Chesapeake. He has French soldiers on board that disembark to help join the battle because Washington has actually already gotten there. The battle has started. On September 6th, the British Navy arrives to help support Cornwallis, and they're defeated by de Grasse. They give up, realize there's no saving Cornwallis, and they sail away. So now Cornwallis is stuck in this easily defensible spot with no way to escape. And the Americans and the French, who have now grown to a force of around 16,000, lay siege to Yorktown. By October 17th, Cornwallis realizes that the end is nigh, and he sues for peace. And 7,000 redcoats march out to the tune of "The World Turned Upside Down," which was what was playing when y'all came in, which is actually a drinking song about Cromwell's time as rule when Christmas was banned in England. And whether that's actually true or not, there is some question, but it makes for a great story. So the fight, and Cornwallis refused to actually come out and meet Washington. He sent a courier with his sword and slunk back to England. So the war is over. We're no longer a British colony, but really the organization part is just starting. On February 27, 1782, the House of Commons voted against continuing the war. On March 20th, Lord North is finally allowed to resign. And the Continental Congress names John Adams, who was in the Netherlands on state business, John Jay, who was a diplomat to Spain at the time, and Benjamin Franklin, who had been a diplomat to Paris, are engaged to go and negotiate the peace treaty. I mean, heck, they're already in Europe. They're the closest ones. Jay and Franklin are going to do most of the work, and they start negotiating. Now, there's a problem, though. We promised the French that we wouldn't sign a peace treaty without their consent, that we all had to be in it together. We would fight to the end. We would make peace together. The French had allied also with Spain, and Spain wanted Gibraltar back, which is an island that the British had taken from Spain. Jay fears that the French will seek a separate peace in order to get Gibraltar for the Spanish and give away the store. He's not real sure what. He thinks that the French will turn over, but he doesn't want to lose. So Franklin and Jay decide that they're going to beat the French to the punch. And on November 30th, 1872, a preliminary treaty is set with Great Britain. Now, they break the spirit of the agreement, but they don't break the letter of the law because they tell the French minister the day before it's signed. And he agrees. So technically, they don't break the alliance, but they kind of do. The Treaty of Paris is signed on September 3rd, 1783. Are we into 83? That should be 80. I think that should be 82. Sorry. Make that 82. Great Britain recognizes independence with Missouri as the western boundary. The northern and southern boundaries are kind of vague. And Spain does get something out of it. They get Florida back. But the British also will grant the Americans continuation of fishing rights off of Newfoundland and in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, withdrawing rights on the unsettled coast of Canada. One of the biggest sticking points was the question of debts. American and British merchants had been trading before the war. Loyalist property had been taken. How was that going to be dealt with? And all that the Americans would offer was a vague promise that merchants should meet, quote, no legal impediment, and that Congress would, quote, earnestly recommend, unquote, that states restore confiscated Loyalist property. So basically, it's like try to collect your debts. Legally, we're not going to stop you, but good luck with that. And maybe the Loyalists will get their property back. Maybe not. We'll see. Why would they want to come back? But they might. But the revolution was more than just a fight. The revolution goes beyond the battlefield. It was a political revolution. They're promoting a very radical idea, this idea of a Republican ideology. What they're trying to create is a nation whose citizens were deemed equal before the law and govern themselves through elected and appointed representatives. This isn't like anything anyone else in the world is doing. It cherished individual liberty. It feared centralized power. There were to be counterbalancing forces, and it was presumed, and this is why a lot of people weren't doing it, that it would only survive as long as people were virtuous and placed the good of society above self-interest. When asked why they fought, one soldier, many years after the battle, responding to a young correspondent, the correspondent asked, why you fought? He said, what were they, the oppressions? I didn't feel them. Well, were you not oppressed by the Stamp Act? Asked the correspondents. I never saw one of those stamps. I'm certain I never paid a penny for one of them. Okay, well, correspondent asked, what then about the tea tax? Soldier, tea tax? I never drank a drop of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Okay, well then what was the matter? And what did you mean by going to fight? And the soldier answers, young man, what we meant in going for those redcoats was this. We had always governed ourselves, and we always meant to. They didn't mean that we should. So they fought for their freedom to govern themselves. They fought for this radical idea, which was probably a very vague idea in most people's minds. The state constitutions were the first expressions of this Republican ideology. In most of the states, people were sovereign and the government authority limited. Most included bills of rights, i.e. freedom of speech, trial by jury, freedom from self-incrimination. Most had elected governors, senates, and councils, because now there's no one to appoint them. And they don't want them appointed, they want them chosen. Most included a separation of powers. Most gave more power to the assembly and less to the governor. Okay, we're going to stop there. We'll pick up. Dang it, I thought I could get through this in one day, and I can't. We'll pick up with the Articles of Confederation when we get back. And we will finish this next time. Getting closer.
All right, have a good day.
You too.
Gotta do some search around the school for landmarks.
Okay. Keep your mask on or they're gonna snag you. Hello.